This video will demonstrate how to create the reverse slipped plait cable in knitting. This is made up of an 8-row repeat where the cables themselves are made in a multiple of 9 stitches. For this swatch, I've created a border of knit stitches and 2 separate plait cables. So I've cast on 24 stitches with the first 3 and last 3 being knit stitches. This pattern is made up of an 8-row repeat, and you'll start with a wrong side row. For your first row, like I said, I've got a swatch here that has a border of garter stitch for both sides in an extra 3 stitches. That just helps us get to our 6-inch swatch that we're trying to make. So I'm going to start with those 3 knit stitches. And the next 9 stitches are creating that first plait cable. And we'll set up the foundation of that cable by knitting 2, purling 5, and knitting 2 again. So we're going to knit 2, purl 5, and then knit 2 again. So this cable portion spans over 9 stitches. I'm gonna slip a marker. I've got 2 plait cables here, so I'll show you that again. We're gonna knit 2, purl 5, this is just our foundation row, and then knit 2 more inside that pattern for the cable, and then for our pattern for our swatch, we're going to add our garter stitch border and knit 3 more stitches there. Then we'll turn our work, and this will be, the second row will be a right side row. In our second row, we're going to start with that garter stitch border. We'll knit 3. And then we're on to our first set of 9 stitches to make up our first cable here. And we are going to purl 2, and then we're going to slip a stitch. So that's our second purl 2. We're going to slip a stitch with the yarn in the back. So we'll slip that, and then we're going to knit 4 stitches. then we'll purl 2 again. So those 9 stitches are gonna make up the base of our cable there. And to complete row 2 for this particular pattern, you'll repeat those last 9 stitches we did and then end with a knit 3. And then we'll turn our work for row 3. Our third row, we'll make our border here with our 3 knit stitches, just working garter stitch all up that edge for this pattern. And then we're on to our first set of 9 stitches within our cable. And for a row 3, we're gonna first knit 2 stitches. Then we will purl 4 of them. And then we're gonna slip a stitch, but we're gonna hold the yarn in front. So our last row, we slipped this same stitch with our yarn in back. Now we're gonna do that with the yarn in front and finish out by knitting the final 2 in that 9 stitch cable. I'll repeat the same process for these next 9 and then knit our last 3 border stitches, and we'll move on to row 4. In our 4th row, you'll see that we're going to create the first little edge of this cable. So this will create this sort of elongated stitch to create the first sort of loop in that cable. So our row 4, of course, we will make our border with that knit 3. And then we'll look at our next 9 stitches, which are part of that cable. And we're first going to purl 2 stitches. Once you purl those stitches, you'll recognize the next stitch as the past stitch from the previous 2 rows. And we're gonna drop that stitch into the front of our work. I don't think it's necessary with this yarn to hold this onto a cable needle, but you might feel more comfortable doing it that way. So you're gonna hold this one in the front. You can put that on a cable needle or a double pointed needle if you'd like to hold its spot. And then we're gonna knit the next 2 stitches. And then we're gonna pick that stitch back up and knit. Okay. And so you'll see that stitch then kind of lays over those other 2 stitches that replaced it. And then we're gonna knit 2 more stitches and purl 2 stitches. That's what creates our first slanted stitch there. That kind of creates that cable look. We'll move on and repeat those last 9 stitches again here, and then add our border. And we'll move on to row 5. So as you can see, to create this pattern, we've got our first 4 rows contain this slanted stitch this way, and then our next 4 rows are going to create this second part of the cable, and the slanted stitch is going to go the other way. So for our row 5, you'll actually just repeat what we used as row 1, which of course we'll add our border, our knit 3, and then we'll knit 2, purl 5, knit 2, and then repeat across. In row 6, we'll start with our knit 3, keeping that garter stitch border going. And then moving on to our cable, we're going to purl 2, we'll knit 4, and then we're going to slip a stitch with the yarn held in back, and we'll purl 2. We'll repeat those 9 stitches over our next cable here, add our border, and move on to our second to last row, which is row 7. Moving on to row 7, which is a wrong side row, we will establish our border with that knit 3. And then move on to the next step in our cable. We will knit 2 first. Then we're going to slip 1. So this is the same stitch we slipped for the last row with the yarn in front. And then we're going to purl 4. And then knit 2. We'll repeat those 9, add our border, and then come in for our final row, row 8. For our 8th row, I wanted to show you how this edge of the cable slants in towards the right. So I've done our border and knit our first cable, but this is ultimately what the shape of that cable will look like. So I wanted to show you that before we moved on to creating the second set of 9 here. So you'll start by purling your first 2 stitches of the cable, and then knitting 2. To enable that slant, we're going to do something a little bit different here. We're going to keep our yarn in the back, and we're going to slip 2 stitches. Then you'll see we've got that slipped stitch from the previous row. We're going to pull that one to the front. We're going to slip those last 2 knit stitches back onto the left-hand needle. And then pick up that drop stitch. So we're just sort of reorienting those stitches to have this slipped stitch from the previous row slant the opposite way than in our row 4. So then we'll just knit those across. We'll knit 1, 2, 3. And then we'll finish out that cable by purling those last 2 stitches. And since we're at the end of the row, then we'll knit the remainder of the border. So that's how we create our cables here. I think this is a really interesting cable stitch because these cables lay really flat. It ends up being sort of the perfect cable stitch for anything that isn't worked in the round. You could work it in the round too, but it lays a little bit more flat than your traditional cable stitch, and it's not fully necessary to use a cable needle to do it. So you continue to repeat those 8 rows and you can carry that cable all the way up your work.